Welcome to the Lawyering Peace podcast series, where we explore the art of diplomacy, the practice of peace building, and the legal and policy frameworks that shape global order. I'm excited to welcome our guest today, an old friend and former student, Kat Fotovat. Kat, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Dr. Williams. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Just got back from taking Scrappy for a walk, so I'm in a good mood. Let's I'll kick this off with my brief little bio, then I'll turn to Kat's bio. As our listeners know, I'm Paul Williams. I'm the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. Now, today's episode is part of our ongoing series on paradigm shifts. We'll talk about how the international system is changing, how that's reshaping long-standing approaches to gender issues, and what it might mean to develop AI, artificial intelligence, in ways that better support women peace builders. Kat is widely recognized as a global gender and AI policy expert. For 2 decades, she has worked across conflict and post-conflict settings, shaping policy on gender equality, atrocity prevention, peace building, and human rights. Her career spans senior leadership roles across the U.S. State Department, previously serving as an ambassador at large at the Office of Global Women's Issues, and as the U.S. focal point for women, peace, and security. Kat currently serves as a senior policy advisor at the Swanee Hunt Family Foundation and is the co-founder of Peace Pays, an organization that strengthens women-led peace networks and brings women peace builders and technologies together to co-design inclusive and humane AI. But I have to tell you, Kat got her start in international law and affairs at American University as one of our superstar JDMA students, and she got her business start as the babysitter for my daughter, Samantha, back in the days when we did the summer program in Santiago, Chile together. So, Kat, for many, many reasons, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today, and I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
Thanks so much, Paul. And I have to say, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I mean, you've been a mentor and truly somebody that's so supportive of just personally my career and work. And, I really, really appreciate having this opportunity to chat with you. It's always good to bounce ideas off as well.
Well, I'm looking forward to bouncing a few of those ideas and to getting educated myself on your perspective on this paradigm shift that we see going on before us, happening in our time. But let's start our conversation with where you started your journey to peace building, gender issues, and then more recently blending it into artificial intelligence. In middle school, did you decide this was something you wanted to dedicate your life to? High school, college? What prompted you to say, this is what I want to do?
Well, it was you, clearly. It was working with you. Certainly, I think PLPG had a huge influence on me. I am, by birth, I'm an Iranian American. Actually, I was born in Iran, came to the United States at the age of 3, so was always very well aware of many of the rights that I had as a U.S. American citizen that I would not have had in Iran. So I think that really influenced my perspectives on women's rights and certainly human rights as well. Working throughout the US, I was also a Peace Corps volunteer as well as an AmeriCorps volunteer. So when Peace Corps, I was started an anti-trafficking in persons organization in Moldova. When I went there, it was right before 9/11 and really right before people got interested or at least knowledgeable about what trafficking in persons was, and really started to find out more about it when 9 of my students in the village where I was went missing. So I went up to the US Embassy and I said, they keep telling me in Romanian they were sold and this makes zero sense to me. What's happened? They said, okay, well, there's this trafficking in persons issue, which of course has been happening for centuries, but not a phenomenon that we were really well aware of at that time. So I ended up starting an anti-trafficking in persons organization. And then From there, actually, John Ashcroft did a conference in the United States and invited my organization actually to present some of the work that we had been doing because we had been working with children all over the country of Moldova and teaching them both about computers because we were working with this organization named IREX and as well as teaching them awareness on trafficking in person. So the State Department started to recruit me from that point on in terms of you are very, very helpful and understand this issue better than almost anybody, and you have language skills. Very, very true. So I decided after law school to actually go directly into the State Department and start working with the Trafficking Persons Office. And from there, focused in a lot on human rights issues. So I was in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I had worked with UNHCR for about 6 months when I was in Iran as well, and focused in on helping Afghan women do income generating work. Also, again, this was back in 2002, so before I'd gone to law school or anything. At that point, it was kind of shocking to me that anybody would leave a country and come to seek, human rights or women's rights are better in Iran than in Afghanistan. So that was kind of my first introduction to the Taliban. And so certainly coming back and starting to work for the US government, a huge focus for me was also on how do we help Afghan women? How do we help women in areas where there's being atrocities, committed against them? How do we help empower them? How do we actually, work within international human rights law to make sure that the commitments that these countries have made are actually being followed through on, which of course they weren't. I was very happy to have led and in the Iran context when I was at the Office of Global Women's Issues, we really worked very hard to get Iran removed from the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN based upon the commitments they had made and had not followed through with. Needless to say, that has made me a target. Apparently, I'm on a kidnap list, just so we're all aware. um, but yes, absolutely. And then for quite a few years and working with UNPILPG, worked on Kosovo. Yesterday was Kosovo Independence Day. So I
Yes.
got to work on the Kosovo Constitution and still very much in contact with many, many of them, which has been truly an honor of my life. Get a chance to speak to, a president that we've been able to work with for years and contacts there. There are a lot of women actually from the Kosovo context that we've been able to utilize their expertise in teaching about sexual gender-based violence and, as the first country ever to provide restitution to survivors, we've been able to work with them as well to teach many countries, including Ukraine, on both the pluses and minuses of what they went through and instituting those, that support for those survivors as well. So all of that to say, that's really helped me come around to how do I make sure to continue to do this work now that many of these human rights apparatus within the State Department have been closed, including my old office, the Office of Global Women's Issues. So coming out of that, basically, a lot of people are asking me what's missing now. What are you the most worried about missing? And I had a huge network of about thousands and thousands of women activists and peace builders all over the world. And we had created many emergency funds, early warning systems, things of that nature. And so was looking for a way to actually be able to continue to do that work and support them. Was having a conversation actually with an Afghan woman that said, well, why do we even need, entities such as like a Chemonics or any of the, other international organizations? And I was like, there are ways to actually deal with this. And there's AI now. So that opened up this entire platform of work that we started to do.
Well, Kat, I want to, you've just hit on 4 or 5 things that I want to dive in with you on and unpack and talk about. First, for our listeners, let's though start with a basic understanding of gender policy, gender issues. What are 4 or 5 of the core elements that define today's global gender issues? So when we talk about, well, basically gender, what do we really mean? Gender protection, empowerment, and it's particularly in conflict and post-conflict, sexual gender-based violence. What gets packaged into this notion of gender?
I think it's obviously a combination of many factors, but looking at ways that we are doing preventative work against violence against women, also protection efforts around protecting women who are being harassed, attacked, and then promotion of their ability to participate, to actively engage and be able to participate in political processes, in economic processes. It's basic human rights that should be being promoted and based upon, someone's gender and on the basis of gender are not being challenged or prohibited from them. So we try to find ways to address those particular challenges and barriers that are just intrinsic on women. Most of that actually, is centered around violence, which is not necessarily what should always be focused in on. It often puts women in just kind of a corner of victims, and instead of looking at them as individuals that have agency and can create change and actually are actively involved in everything across the political and economic spectrum. So making sure to address violence against women as a piece of gender, but that's not the totality. There's a lot of talks about, also sexual reproductive health issues, things of that nature. But again, these are just pieces of gender. And one of the things that we are very careful about not just siloing women's and gender issues into. That also includes the plethora of LGBTQI issues and looking at how do people define themselves and their ability to actually, be who they are and be protected throughout any kind of international fora as well.
Kat, let's now move you back to your time at the State Department and talk a little bit about your day-to-day work on those different dimensions of the issues. And you were Trump administration, Biden administration, and then a little bit of time in the new Trump administration. So feel free to compare and contrast or not. Maybe it was the same all the way through. But sort of a multi-part question. What I'm giving you flexibility here, Kat, to go whichever way you want.
Game changer.
On a day-to-day basis, what were you doing inside the State Department? Because some of our listeners will think, oh yeah, gender issues, really, really important. Wait, State Department, U.S. foreign policy. Okay, there's USAID, but what was State Department doing on gender issues? And where were you pleasantly surprised that there was engagement, dynamism, and forward movement? And where were you surprised or expected barriers and pushback?
Yeah, I mean, I had been working at the State Department. Actually, I was hired under the Bush administration, so I've been there W. So I had been there for quite some time. In that kind of transition between the first Trump administration to the Biden administration to the next Trump administration, I would say the trajectory really changed in terms of like focus areas. There was kind of a pushback on gender in general from the first Trump administration. We were very lucky in that they were very focused on economic opportunities, and we did have, a connection with Ivanka Trump. So we did bring in this champion of Ivanka Trump, who thankfully really, she was an entrepreneur herself. So there was a connection there to be able to say, okay, we'd love to like push women's economic empowerment as an opportunity. There are countries that, were very open to engaging with the Trump administration, the Gulf states in particular. There were a lot of human rights and women's rights issues that we had openings into that we didn't have openings before, and especially focused on economic opportunities. Everything from being able to have driver's licenses in Saudi Arabia to other things. Like these were issues that were very difficult to speak to them about, but they were much more open and engaging. So making that business case of the way we really functioned in the State Department was making sure that the mission and what was trying to be accomplished under the mission of foreign policy in any engagement included women. So even if it was anything from international security issues, if you start talking about things like violent extremist groups, the entities that often are the ones standing up in a community or a country against violent extremist groups are women. So if you talk about Gaza, the proportion of women versus men in Gaza that are against Hamas, the women were, 80 at that point were 80% less likely to be supportive of Hamas than the men. Same in Afghanistan. It was basically like almost 90% of the women were against the Taliban, whereas with the men, it was almost the complete reverse. So in terms of our own focus, international human rights commitments, and our own focus through democracy promotion and human rights, the women were actually much more geared to making sure that the US focus was actually something that was being achieved. And so they were often our best sources of intelligence, our best sources of support, because it was in their best, their own interests actually to help our issues move forward. So that kind of mission focus, whether it be national security or economic, support, making the case to make sure that we understood, for example, a peace agreement is more, 35% more likely to last 15 years or more if women are included. So it became less about making it something that was seen as DEI or something else, and more really about the success of what the actual policy that we were trying to achieve was. So bringing that data was really important, and making sure that those bullet points, we always said in the State Department, you didn't want to be, bullet point number 4 on a 3 point, document. So we always tried to make sure that gender was highlighted, especially in areas that it really was a priority issue.
Well, Kat, at lunch the other day, you were telling me a story about a quizzical conversation you had with the Saudi representative, where they were wondering how it is that they had gotten ahead of America
Yeah,
on
yeah.
gender issues.
That
And
moment.
what was that moment when the Saudis are like, "Come on, America, you got to step up your game on gender issues."
Yeah. So Saudi Arabia actually, and we had, I don't want to say we were reluctant that Saudi Arabia for about 4 years was slated to chair the Commission on the Status of Women at the UN. And so there was a lot of consternation about Saudi Arabia chairing this commission. And interestingly enough, in this last, not this coming March, but last March when I was representing the United States government, and there was a lot of pushback on gender, or even honestly using the word women. We're at the Commission on the Status of Women, and I was being told not to use the word women. It was a difficult conversation across the board. And so when we were coming up with the overall statement from the commission, the United States was pushing back quite a bit on pretty much everything, to which the Saudi representative said, "You all are not good on women's rights." That was, one of those moments when you are like, yeah, this is my line, like this. I think you try to do as much good as you can for as long as you can. And at that point, I kind of was like, am I doing good now? And what could I do to make sure that I was able to exit gracefully in a way that I left as much of a legacy as possible on gender issues and on women's rights for the department. And we've integrated it enough and institutionalized it enough that a lot of it will hopefully still stand. And yeah, that was a very impactful conversation that I had in my own career.
Well, that's yeah, getting
Needless to say,
scolded.
I voluntarily retired shortly after that.
That's when you want to be talking point number 4 on a 3 point list of talking
Yeah,
points.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned something earlier about the defunding of USAID, and how on one hand that's quite catastrophic for the work that the United States government and many organizations in the United States and abroad have been doing on women's issues. But at the same time, you hinted at, and a number of individuals I've spoken with have hinted at, well, maybe it's an opportunity to do it differently. Now, we don't need to have a conversation about how AID spun out of control with 40, 50, 60% overheads and Taj Mahal offices on K Street. But what do you see as a potential positive outcome, or how are you making lemonade out of lemons with the reconfiguration of the funding? Meaning mostly no funding, but
Yeah,
at
I
some
mean,
point funding
I
will
call it
return, yeah, private or publicly.
yeah, I call it a opportunity. It's a problem that is now an opportunity. And to be honest with you, if I was still inside the US government, I think it would be much more difficult to shove, what I see as kind of the tsunami coming of AI into this world. And often people are so used to kind of what, the bureaucracy likes to talk about what the bureaucracy was talking about last year and the year before and the year before. And so it's really hard to get these kind of, as we're talking about paradigm shifts, we are literally in a paradigm shift. To me, the paradigm shift is really about, this digital oligarchies that are forming now. And so looking at how do we address these digital oligarchies and then be able to actually pivot and make them actually work for us. So I think that's been a huge focus. But, I think this deconstruction and kind of reconstruction of a new framework, I think is really important to address, and something that can be done much quicker on the outside. So in looking at, and talking to the individuals in this huge network that I have of women, women are really well placed to be able to actually utilize AI. They're very conversational. They can be that kind of mesh within a community to teach others how to actually utilize this. It's just they have to get over that fear of what is this thing. They also have to feel comfortable and safe within that space. And right now, as I've been talking to a lot of people in the AI industry, I keep telling them AI is kind of like a naughty teenage boy right now. It's really all about boobs and hate. So we really need to kind of teach it to actually function in a way that actually will help bring more of a, an egalitarian and equal tool for everyone to be able to leverage across the board. And so that's been our focus of seeing this opportunity of all these things falling apart. But it now is really a time when this thing, we can say, hey, you get this training and it'll fill this gap of you won't need a Deloitte or a Chemonics or another entity to teach you these things. It can write a proposal for you. It can write that email for you. And a lot of them are very scared about English being their third, fourth, fifth language. It can do a lot of those things that you needed another larger entity to do.
Oh, Kat, I use my AI to improve my English.
Yeah.
I split my infinitives. I forget whether I'm supposed to use the Oxford comma or not, but my AI makes me sound smarter than I am. Well, Kat, let's talk about this paradigm shift because we're experiencing two paradigm shifts where there's the AI tsunami, which is a paradigm shift in economics, in workflow, in all kinds of things. But we're also experiencing a paradigm shift in the global order from what some would say was a rules-based. You and I, as lawyers, would say, yeah, rules-based. It was rules that governed. Others would say it's a liberal international order. Others would say, no, it was just hegemonic interest of the superpowers dressed up as a rules-based order. But whatever it is, it seems to be shifting, and there seem to be competing narratives about what the new paradigm should be. What are what are your thoughts on that? Everything from nope, there's always zigging and zagging. This is just another zig to oh, this is something new, and this is where it's headed, and that's okay, that's good, that's bad, that's scary.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the issues that we've been grappling with is just the paradigm shift to me has really been the private sector and their influence across the board globally, and how that really is. So it's really gone from a, kind of a government focus to, again, a corporate focused power structure and their influence over government and over the actual way we all function. I do think it's important that we still have international standards and laws in place. Someone once told me, because I get very frustrated whenever I go to the UN in terms of like, all we do is talk, all we do is talk. There's no action, and someone said, well, as long as they're talking, they're not fighting, right? And I thought that was actually a nice way to put it. So it was actually meaningful. And I do think that we need, again, to remember that the talking and the standards in place are necessary in order to make sure that we are committing ourselves to have a peaceful global environment. Now, the added, again, digital oligarchies that are here, I remember the speech that Mark Carney gave at Davos was, I think, indicative of, I think, a lot of our quote unquote allies in the middle kind of countries are starting to formulate their own ways forward. And it seems very isolated in how a lot of them are functioning. I killed myself for 2 decades trying to make people turn away from China, and ASEAN was a huge focus for me. And we managed to get so many countries to understand like your GDP together as ASEAN is actually greater than China's, and you have power. And as long as the United States government felt like it was supporting them, they were much more willing to, stand up and work together. That's kind of all gone now. I literally killed myself for 2 decades. So I think that we just need to recognize where this, power shift is going. I do think we need to engage with the private sector a lot more. The international community has always really had a hard time dealing with non-state actors. I mean, even in whenever we would talk about things having to do with violent extremists or how we would be talking about ISIS or, other entities like that, it was just kind of people didn't know what to do. So it really was confusing to them. But now we have another huge non-state actor, which is these very large corporations that have kind of taken over. But we have to be willing to actually force them to also adhere to these international standards and have these conversations. To the extent that genie's already out of the bottle, probably very true, but that does not take away the fact that often we overshoot whatever it is, and then people have to have a standard to come back to. So I do think it's important to keep some of these structures in place, to keep civility in place, to keep these mechanisms in place, because I do think one of the other issues that I think will come out, and really in talking about that paradigm shift, I think one of the issues that is really being overlooked, because we've all forgotten about it, even though it's probably the biggest thing facing us, is climate change. I think climate change, whether it be if we talk about like what happened in Syria, how much of the civil war was really started out of the lack of water and issues having to do with people migrating No, that exacerbates tensions and conflicts. And looking at things through the lens of, technology now, much of those avenues are actually being looked at with AI, right? And if AI right now, which doesn't include the voices of women and how it's functioning, doesn't include safety constructions, doesn't include ways to make sure that their perspectives are brought in early on, or even looking at things like peace agreements or aid agreements, humanitarian assistance agreements, very things are very neutral now in how they're kind of being framed. And so taking women out or taking that gender perspective out of those discussions and making them much more neutralized and more legalistic in without that input of women in those systems really can have horrible effects. So again, when we start talking about peace agreements being much more effective if women are included, it's almost like they're being neutralized now. And so the effectiveness will actually be reduced. We're kind of at this point where we are sacrificing consistency, connection, and effectiveness for basically for efficiency. Like it's really coming down to just making things efficient and more capitalistic.
Well, I want to in a few moments I want to dive into that because there's that is that duality of AI can make women peace builders much more impactful and engaged. We're advising a handful of female civil society organizations, and you can tell when they've checked out AI the night before they have the conversation with us the next day because they're all of a sudden smarter than we are on the core elements of a ceasefire. But we'll want to see about how do you get that sort of maternal dimension into the AI programming. But before we get there, I want to ask two other questions on artificial intelligence. One quick one and then more detailed. The more detailed one is the divide, the AI divide. It's in the United States. It's the Magnificent Seven, or it's the frontier labs in artificial intelligence. In China, it's sort of the Magnificent One, since it's state owned. But how is that the fact that the compute that the knowledge is basically American or Chinese AI, doesn't really include the Europeans, doesn't really include the global South? And is there a difference between how the Americans are approaching it and how the Chinese are approaching it with respect to the issues that you care about? But first, my question is, have you named your AI? And if so, what have you called it?
I actually do. I have named my AI. I call her Kiri. Kind
You
of a
call it,
Siri cat combo. So, we do have discussions quite a bit, but just in terms of that kind of digital divide issue, one of the where we've kind of focused in on is making sure that the LLMs, the Magnificent Seven, as you noted, we brought to them the case of having to do with this maternal instinct. Actually, there is a professor at the University of Toronto. They call him the godfather of AI, basically. Jeffrey Hinton is his name. And he basically said AI is going to take over humanity and we don't even know what it's going to do in terms of like destructiveness if we do not teach it to see humanity as actually something that it would sacrifice itself for. And the only thing that biologically actually does that is a maternal instinct or a parental instinct. So we have to actually teach it that. The problem is, again, as we're noting, everything that's been provided as the basis of input right now has really been focused in on capitalistic gains, hate, and honestly, pornography. So that's not necessarily a paternalistic or maternalistic instinct that's really coming out. So we've brought that to a lot of the industry leaders and said, you're all worried about this, and how are you actually fixing it? Because there is a new generation of generative AI that's coming out, and what is the basis that you're using actually to teach that? Believe it or not, that resonated, and it's shockingly. So we've actually had a lot of movement actually from those LLMs who said like, okay, we agree, we're building this new generative AI, and there is these artifacts that we actually teach the AI models to actually learn from. Now, if you all want to give us these new scenarios that we build out and these new taxonomy questions, we'd be happy to actually use that as some of the DNA and kind of the backbone of what this new AI, generative AI, will actually be able to learn from and kind of build the empathy around, build that kind of wisdom that we're now trying to teach this new version of AI into. So we've had, open AI as well as Anthropic has come in. Meta has also said we're happy to participate. So we've had quite a few of them actually come and say like we are willing, as industry battalions to actually take this information and put it in. They've already actually put together, they have an entity basically called AI for Humanity where they come and talk about some of these issues. A lot of them actually formulated this thing called Positive AI Labs, which is actually looking for information such as this, but they've agreed to make gender and peace building kind of their focus pilots. And so we have made the case of having actual discussions and convenings with women peace builders across the world. So bringing them together. Stanford has said, we'd be happy to actually host your first convening. So we'd love to bring in industry leaders. We have the academic, experts coming in and then bringing women together to talk about how to put basically these scenarios in that will be the backbone of how this new generative AI that functions. Our focus is also then what? We're looking to expand that platform even further, partnering with other academic institutions and building kind of a cohort of students that are actually also able, I learned from somebody very brilliant named Dr. Williams, target the students and then they go into the corporations and then they will continue to often advocate for these issues within their own work that they do and possibly even be able to provide in-kind contributions and continuing to train some of these women and peace builders around the world. So our hope that this kind of creates an ecosystem of being able to provide information to the AI models. We'd love to be able to also grade them. So how are they doing? And for the certain AI models that are not as willing to take this information, maybe shame them a little bit by showing the public that, this one is not so safe for you as a woman or not so inclusive of you as a peace builder or just is not as empathetic. So be able to grade them as well so that there's a little more of a catalyst and an incentive to actually make them actually be more inclusive.
Kat, let's now go to the other end of the workflow with the women that you're working with in conflict, post-conflict settings, the women on the ground that are running their own nonprofits or that are members of the delegations, the government delegation, the opposition, the civil society delegation. What are you doing with AI with them? How are you working with them to utilize AI to empower and to amplify their voice?
So we had we just to see if I was insane, we had actually a convening in New York around the UN General Assembly. So we brought together some industry leaders, AI engineers, and then I kind of unleashed a lot of the women peace builders that we've been working with for years. So we brought in Ukrainians, we brought in Syrians, we brought in, even the white helmets were there. We brought in women from Kosovo, from the Gambia, from Sudan. We brought in women from 11 different countries, post-conflict and conflict affected. And they were just telling their stories and how AI was actually being used against them. So often it was things like deepfakes, deeply sexual, threatening, harassing information, or how, other entities such as the Russian government was actually targeting them as well by utilizing AI. It was interesting because many of these AI engineers and industry leaders had no idea. We had two AI engineers actually start crying after hearing like how this tool that they had dedicated their lives to was really being used for really horrible purposes. And out of that one meeting, we had a company named Ziff Davis that said right away, we will give every single one of these women our C-suite training to train them how to utilize AI just on a day-to-day basis. And then if that works well, we'll go to the next phase, which is giving them, Google certifications on AI and teaching them really how to not only utilize it all, but also we are creating a curriculum around how to do so safely. Because one of the things that seems to be missing even in this curriculum development around how to utilize AI is specific issues around vulnerability specifically to women and how do they do that safely. And then a lot of the issues that they're working on, there are a lot of privacy issues. They might have gender-based violence cases, there's rape cases, other things. So how do they protect the privacy of those individuals? So thinking that through with the trainers themselves. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that all of these women have training on AI, both from the perspective of being able to do preventative work by feeding into things like early warning systems, but then also being able to have that kind of prevention work as well as protective work. So we used to have with this organization called Inner News, what we called a first aid kit for online violence, but it really wasn't geared towards AI. So it's now, interestingly enough, I know I was actually doxxed myself in last year, believe it or not. So it was interesting as someone who used to lead the Internet Freedom team in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. And I would often teach people about like, here's how you actually deal with online violence, and here's what you need to be protected. I was applying all of these things to myself, but also now with this added level of AI included. So I just led actually a training for some women in Minnesota who had been doxxed, who had called me and said, "Hey, we heard you might know how to do some of these things." Yeah. So, we're looking at it from that perspective of how do we make sure to protect them online, prevent violence, as well as be empowering to them so that they can use AI for the next level, which is storytelling and promotion of their issues. The other piece of this, and this is kind of where that AI, the USAID loop comes back, is how do we create sustainable models for these organizations and these women to actually be able to function continually without the need for international funding, which includes things like if we're giving them curriculum on how to function with AI, they can turn around and be leaders in their own countries and their communities on AI. And that's kind of the case we've been making to the industry leaders as well. If these are, you are missing 50% of your potential clientele, why are you not opening it up and being much more inclusive to the women so you can include the other 50% and they might be leaders within their countries that can actually help open up new opportunities for you?
Kat, you've mentioned a number of times that you said well, we do this or we train or we provide this type of assistance. And as we mentioned in the introduction, you've created an organization. You're a co-founder of Peace Pays. Now, many of the mid-career professionals, the young career professionals that are among our thousands of listeners are intrigued and cautiously optimistic about the ability to start their own organizations in an odd sort of way. With AID collapsing and all the big dogs going out of business, there's a lot more space for new entrants into the civil society market. Can you tell us a little bit about your secret sauce and how you designed the structure of Peace Pays and your mission, whether it's intensely narrow or whether it's flexible? What does a modern startup NGO in the social entrepreneurial space look like in 2026?
Yeah, I mean, I am lucky in that I have three other co-founders besides myself. So we're kind of the fabulous four that come together. And so it's a woman by the name of Jennifer Bradshaw, who worked with the Kroc Institute and also worked with me at the Office of Global Women's Issues. Sabrina Poorman, who has really worked in philanthropy for many, many years. And then this woman by the name of Martha Adams, who she herself is a quite well-known film producer who has done a lot of work focused on gender issues. She did How to Catch a Tiger about the gang rapes in India. She's doing a movie basically called The Burqa Avengers, which is kind of a cartoon about a girl that wears a burqa and really is kind of a ninja. So she's really well known as well. And so we all kind of have our own special gifts that we bring to the table. And I think that's important, is having partnerships and making sure that you're working across, and also having mentors. I mean, you've been, a consummate mentor for me in many, many ways. And, having people that you can bounce ideas off of and, talking to others and really doing that outreach. I fundamentally believe that the private sector is kind of that other pillar that has to come in and we have to tap into now. I mean, they've basically taken all the money. So that's where the money is. If all the water is here, you have to go get the water from there. And so I think it's another language dealing with the private sector, to be honest with you. I'm used to being the one that had $5 billion to like, where does this need to go? Where does that need to go? Kind of thing. And making those decisions. And now we have to actually ask for the cooperation of private sector entities. So again, that's fine because we do make the case of this is why this is much more effective both for you and humanity, and focused on making sure women's empowerment is included. But I do think that something that I think a lot of civil society organizations are not used to doing is working with the private sector. And when you're talking about like, I have to like basically learn, I mean, I have to learn a new language. I have to learn how to speak AI, and that's not easy in many ways. I did actually have an advantage in that I led the Internet Freedom team. So I was able to often translate between human rights defenders and our tech people, like talking to DARPA is like literally another language. So I think it really just takes kind of coming out of the kind of the models that we're used to, and learning how to kind of talk to and include the other that private sector piece of it, but also making the case, and you have to make the business case of this is why it's also better for you as a private sector. What was interesting is after COVID, we had so many corporations actually come to us begging us for help on how do we get women back, because after COVID, so many women left the workforce and it was really affecting the bottom line. So that was an easy way to show them, oh, you've lost all these women who are actually quite, helpful and really helped increase your profit margins. Not having the women there actually decreased everything. So that was actually, they came to us. It was Google, it was Boeing, it was like all these entities that were like, please, 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 we really need help in bringing women back. So I would say really learning how to kind of like find the incentives, find out where, funding is, find out and have those conversations, I think is really important, but also looking to your own network. I had Vital Voices was an organization we used to sponsor. And at one point I said, you should lead, a job fair for all the women, or people working in the gender space. And just even having that community, I think has been really helpful. So I would advocate for people to go reach out to your community, touch base with them, because it's also quite psychologically helpful as well. And been really a nice way to not only work on and collaborate on our issues together, but also help just mentally deal with the insanity that's kind of going on right now.
Kat, you've been so generous with your time. I want to ask you two more questions, if I may. And the penultimate question is predict the future. But with, things are moving so quickly, both with the paradigm shift in the global order, the AI tsunami, the defunding of USAID, and the sort of reconfiguration of the aid community and the assistance to civil society organizations, and the role of gender in conflict resolution, both the positive role in terms of more gender inclusive peace processes being more sustainable and durable, but also this constant, you've seen it for 20 years, I've seen it for 30 years, this constant pushback against gender inclusion in the process. War is a man's game, and so peace building is a man's game. It's the guys with guns that divvy up the resources, the power, et cetera, et cetera. What do you think is going to happen in the next 5 years, 10 years? Predict the future in a point in time where the future is rapidly unfolding before our very eyes. So I realize this is a unanswerable question, but what does Kat or what does Kiri have to say about the future, and what does it look like?
That's a big question, but actually something that I grapple with and actually gives me a little bit of hope. I really believe that AI is actually a tool that can kind of level the playing field across the board. And that's not to say it can do everything. Again, it can't build trust between people. It certainly, that's the purpose of diplomacy and other things. It's certainly there are things having to do with development and humanitarian assistance, and there's hundreds of thousands to millions of people that have, died as a result of, not having a very strategic withdrawal from that, and that all those things are horrific and really nothing AI can actually do to solve those things. However, we've seen AI really be able to push, if there are countries right now that are actually utilizing AI to actually create their strategic policies for how they're going to move forward as countries right now. So they're doing everything from like doing surveys and then having those surveys come back and AI analyze it and being able to actually like plan out how they're going to do things. One of the things that we brought up to a lot of the industry leaders was, when the threats were going against Greenland, there were very high level people in many countries, including our own, that started putting in AI. What should we do about this? And I don't, I have to say, I think AI is still learning itself. Clearly, we're not at that next generation yet, but I do think that it has the potential to, it's already thousands upon thousands of times smarter than your average person and can, really, process things much faster. I do think as this thing gets smarter and smarter and actually hopefully has some kind of wisdom to it, that it can bring much more peace and prosperity to all. And we'll understand maybe that the overlords that are controlling it do not have necessarily the best intentions for everyone. There are these things called playgrounds also that they bring together the different AI platforms so they can talk together together and kind of see what they come up with to solve certain problems. That's not something that the industry, leaders really like that much because they don't like them to mix, but I think it's inevitable that they will eventually start to talk to each other, and this thing will go around a lot of the barriers that are put in place to actually keep it from doing probably the good that it potentially can do if it has the right inputs and focus.
Kat, I'm glad you're an optimist because, as they always say, it's better to be an optimist and wrong than a pessimist and right. So it's that optimistic nature that I've known that you've had for the last 20 years that always makes these conversations fun and energizing. I want you to leave our audience, our listeners, with your final thought on how to think about gender and the challenges and the opportunities in that space. And what I mean by how is one of my friends once asked me, they said, okay, how should I think about the situation in the Balkans? And this was back in the early to mid 90s. And I started to list off my set of talking points, what should be done. And he said, no, 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 no. Don't tell me what to think. Give me a frame of reference. How should I think about the crisis in the Balkans? I'll fill in what I think then we should be doing, but I want to know how we should think about that. So leave our listeners with some of your wisdom on how to think about gender.
Yeah, I think that the way to really think about it is kind of going back to that maternal instinct, thinking about gender in terms of making sure that it's being included across the board for the best outcomes, for the most effective processes, that the oligarchies in place right now are not gatekeepers against human rights. And often, gender is really a way to normalize and bring, the frontline defenders often into those spaces. So want to make sure that, we are being as inclusive as possible, both from the digital perspective, but also, with respect to the political paradigm shifts that are happening right now. This is really where kind of the rubber meets the road and bringing those challenges forward. So we want to make sure that we're empowering the very people that are presenting themselves to often be the ones to take on power structures, and making sure that we are not having these gatekeepers come in and hold everything back that's hurting the prosperity for us all. So that's my hope, is that maternal instinct will be built into this massive thing that's kind of taking over all of our lives. And it's coming in even avenues that we didn't even expect and at a much faster rate than we all knew. So prepare yourselves, please.
And name your AIs. Develop that relationship with your AI now, so when it does take over the world, it still likes you. I
Exactly.
hope my AI likes me. I'm actually not really sure. I'm afraid to ask it.
Wait, what did you name yours?
Crazy monkey.
Okay, that's right. Crazy.
And it has a personality. It has an edgy personality to go with its name. Kat, it's been a real honor and a privilege to spend this time with you. And I have to say, when people ask me, they say, "Oh yeah, so you teach. What's the best part about teaching? The summer or sabbatical like I'm on now, or the 4-week winter vacation?" I'm like, no, no, no. It's the alumni. Sure, sure. It's the students who are dynamic and engaging, but it's alumni like yourself who go on to do cool and amazing things. And I remember when we first met, it was at the 1L summer program in Santiago. And you were giving all of our guest lecturers a rough time, which I deeply admired. You were taking it to the Americans on, so America, Pinochet, what
Well,
were
you
we
would
up
you would
to?
elbow me and say, like, sounds like you should ask a question.
Because I knew I could count on you to be edgy, and because they're all used to, like, oh, the students come and they ask these nice little questions about what's it like to live in Santiago and what's your favorite flavor, kind of wine, grape varietal, and you're
Yeah.
like making them get serious, making them earn their keep. So that is what is so rewarding about teaching, and I want to thank you for being such an amazing student, and then all of the incredible work you've done these last 2 decades, and then spending your time today to share it with our listeners. So thank you very much, Kat. Deeply appreciated.
Well, thank you as well, Paul, again, for just being a great mentor. You also taught me a lot about parenting, so I will, my best to Sammy and Kathy as well. So, I think it's really important that also as we're looking for how we are actually, I taught a class the other day at Johns Hopkins, and I was like, what a weird time to be a student. But I was just thinking about how lucky I was to have someone at you that was able to not only teach me, inspire me, but also mentor me even, all throughout my career. So many, many thanks to you. I hope all your students and everybody listening, really appreciate that. This is kind of, you're also now teaching me how to continue to be a mentor beyond. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
Well, we have some amazing students at the moment, so I'm looking forward to seeing what they do in the next 20 years. So let me conclude by thanking our listeners for joining us on this episode of Lawyering Peace. We look forward to continuing this series and examining today's paradigm shifts, both in the global order and in AI. And we will see you and hear you next time. Thank you.